Welcome to our adult forum on Ecclesiastes 12. We are going to be exploring the theme of expiration or eschaton today as we read Ecclesiastes 12, 1 through 8. So when I first look at the text, a few questions pop up for me. I wonder, what this is the end of. Is this the end of one person's life, or is this the eschaton? Is this the end of something bigger? You have a loss of pleasure, things darkening, things getting quiet, things getting scary, things starting to break, and then you return home to the earth, to God. Is this just happening to one person, or is this an allegory for what's happening to all of us? I wonder, what is vanity? Is the teacher referring to the whole life, to this particular endeavor, to any particular part of life? I also wondered what the silver cord was. I sort of could kind of visualize like a golden bowl and the pitcher and all of these other pieces, but just in terms of visualizing things, for me, it was a little difficult to visualize specifically what this silver cord was and what it might represent. I also wonder why, at least in the NRSV, there's an admonition to remember the Creator in your youth. Um, and that kind of leads into the next question, which is, how is this text situated in the temporal? So the way the text is situated in time, we're using the words before and when, implying that the now is actually youth. And when we're talking about age, we're looking forward in time. So it's just interesting that the admonition to remember the Creator is not happening um, to the old man or the old person or someone at the end of their life, but to the young person, to the youth. So now I'd love to look more at the world of the text specifically. And I went back to my two favorite translations to look at differences, um, to kind of find where there were a few things that were translated differently that to me kind of seemed pretty big, seemed like they made a difference in how we might understand the text. So the first is the phrase that in the NRSV is translated, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. And in JPS, it's appreciate your vigor in the days of your youth. Remember and appreciate, those I can kind of see working together. But Creator and vigor seems so wildly different to me. So I want to look more into that when we get into our word studies. Then the women who grind cease working because they are few. And then in JPS, it's, and the maids that grind, grown few, are idle. Um, and so in NRSV, the reason that they are not grinding anymore is because there are not very many of them. Whereas in GPS, the fact that they've grown few is set aside. So it's the maids that grind are idle. And it's just mentioned that they're grown few. There's not like the causation uh, piece drawn there. And then also, those who look through the windows see dimly. In JPS, it's translated, the ladies that peer through the windows grow dim. So in NRSV, what's dim is what they're seeing. And in JPS, it's the ladies who are doing the peering who are growing dim. In NRSV, the grasshopper drags itself along and desire fails. And in JPS, the grasshopper be burdened and the caper bush may bud again. So and we'll figure out what this means later, but desire and caper bush don't seem like they would be a one-to-one translation. And we can look more into that as we get into our word studies. And then finally, the last line of the passage, vanity of vanities, says the teacher, all is vanity. And in JPS, it's translated, utter futility, said Koheleth, all is futile. And to me, vanity and futility seem a little bit different. I imagine vanity as someone looking in the mirror, and futility is really just being pointless. So vanity to me reads a little more like as narcissism, whereas futility reads more as something like pointless, nihilistic. There's no nothing really to gain from pursuing this. So now I want to look at the world of the text, and there were a few words that stood out to me. So the first one that I noted that was translated just differently was creator or vigor, and in Hebrew this would be bara. So when I started looking at it in Strong's, it talked about how it was to create, but also to cut down, to select, to feed, to dispatch, a primitive root. And oh, sorry, a primitive root is actually grammatically what it is. And then when I looked in the Old Testament Word Study Dictionary, um, it kind of dispelled the idea that this would mean here that it was to cut down. It showed that it's used most often for creation in Genesis. It's used in Isaiah to describe the heavenly host, the ends of the earth. It's used in the Psalms to describe creation. David asking God to create in him a clean heart. And it's used in a couple of other places, like in Joshua a couple of times, and in Ezekiel as to clear timber. But it's used mostly for creation. So to me, like that sort of resonated with me, using the word for creator. So I'm still a little like interested to know why vigor might have been chosen here by the translators in JPS. But it was great to see sort of how this was used, especially in Genesis. The next word that I was interested in is the abiyona. So translated in NRSV as desire and translated in JPS as the caperberry. So of course, looking into it in Strong's and in BDB complete, it shows really that this is in reference to the caperberry. And Strong's notes that it's provocative of desire, and the caperberry has its stimulative taste. And then the Old Testament Word Study Dictionary says this is means desire that's used to describe the failure of desire on an aging person. Some think the word is better translated to indicate the caperberry, which had become an ineffective stimulant in old age. And this is the only place in the Hebrew Bible that this word is used. And then moving on, I wanted to look at that piece in the last verse of this passage, the word for vanity or futility, hebel. The Old Testament Word Study Dictionary defines it as a common noun referring to vanity, emptiness, meaninglessness, idols. It says the word is used 70 times, and 35 of those are in Ecclesiastes. So you're using this word to mean emptiness, meaninglessness 35 times in Ecclesiastes, which I think speaks maybe more to Ecclesiastes than it does to the meaning of the word itself. But really, it talks about the ultimate emptiness, the ultimate meaninglessness of all things in this life, whether they seem good or bad, which sort of, fits in with our teacher in Ecclesiastes, who not necessarily is saying that everything's meaningless or everything's worthless, but really that there's sort of an all-encompassingness about things that is not necessarily binary. And then Strong's defines it as emptiness or vanity, figuratively something transitory and unsatisfactory. So it's not good, right? But I think what it's doing is like showing an emptiness and not necessarily a narcissism. Okay, so now to move to the world behind the text. So in reading this article called Transcending the Boundary of Death, Ecclesiastes Through a Nabokovian Lens by Michael Karasik, he points to two other authors who I know you'll be more than familiar with, Michael Fox and C.L. Seow. And I'm going to go more into Seow in just a minute. But Michael Karasik quotes them saying, Michael Fox has pointed out that this unsettling, almost surrealistic poem is not merely an allegory of death, but something much stronger. Through the prism of symbolism, the reader sees more than ordinary death and burial. Behind the surface, looming in the background, is a disaster of cosmic magnitude. The author musters images of universal disaster to evoke the unimaginable experience of one's own death, end quote. And so Karasik here, when he goes through a number of the kinds of ways that this can be interpreted, and he does use Nabokov significantly, though I'm not going to go into that. But one of the things that he brings in is that both Michael Fox and C.L. Hsiao point to this, maybe not necessarily as the eschaton, but certainly as something more than just a poem about old age. And so in Kohelet's eschatological poem by C.L. Hsiao in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 1999, he notes that, the Midrash, the Talmud, Jerome, Rashi, Rashbam, Ibn Ezra, they're all saying that this poem is an allegory of old age. There's also an approach that might take the images in verses 3 through 5 to be literal. But to be literal, but he says to have symbolic intent. But then he goes on to say, I submit, however, that the author is taking the message of the book to another level of discourse. The poem as it stands in verses 2 through 7 is no longer about old age per se, although traditional sayings, perhaps even an old poem about old age, may lie in the background. The poet now portrays the demise of human life in entirely eschatological terms. All the images in verses 2 through 7 are consistent with the author's intent to depict a permanent end of human existence, and hence the end of all possibilities to enjoy life either on earth or the hereafter. And so he goes into a number of places where this could be the case. So he notes that the poem in verse 2 starts to be moving to a cosmic plane. It's the final reference to the sun. And he mentions here that the sun is mentioned in Ecclesiastes 35 times, but, quote, now in its final appearance, the sun is darkened. And he also notes that, quote, this dimming of lights seems ironic, terribly ironic, for it was through the Creator that light itself and the luminaries of day and night were first set in the sky to illumine the earth. And then he talks more about the grinding of the women, the sort of metaphor of grinding. And so there's this idea that maybe the grinding is of teeth, maybe the grinding is of mill. The second time it's referenced, it's, I think, more clearly talking about a mill. But what Xiao says is not necessarily that the grinders just sort of stop because there are fewer of them, but that the grinders have suddenly died. He says, for the text is describing what is happening not over a period of time, not days or years, as in verse 1, but on the day when all of these things happen. These women stop work because something terrible is suddenly happening, and some of their number have already disappeared. If only in a limited way, the vocabulary here echoes the description of the end time in the New Testament. Quote, then 2 will be working in the field, 1 is taken and 1 is left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, 1 is taken and 1 is left, end quote. He also talks about how the ways in which the women looking out of the windows, how that's what's dimming, not necessarily, he says, the eyes themselves, but the women. I guess sort of like maybe a little bit of synecdoche. He talks about how life's routines are not just interrupted at home, but the double doors of the street bazaar are closed. So the doors of the street are closed. The mourners are on the streets. It's not just happening in one person's individual home. Silencing of the mill is also like a big deal. It's not just one individual thing that's happening. Xiao notes that, quote, since in antiquity bread had to be baked daily, the sound of grain being milled was an assuring sign of human life, end quote. And he also says that, like, it just seems like there are bad things happening all over, all the time throughout this passage. And then he says, quote, only at the end of the passage, however, does the reader realize what it is the signs portend, which he is saying is the eschaton. And I'm not sure I can go all the way that far because I don't know enough, but I'm just going to throw this out there on his behalf. And I had a question at the beginning about what the silver cord was. And so he goes into this in depth for pages and pages, actually talking about like what the silver cord might be, what the bowl might be, how hard it would be to crush the bowl. And kind of what this all leads to is that the silver cord and the golden bowl can be a kind of lamp. And that lamps were often buried, like in Palestine, were buried with people in their tombs. And he says, quote, Kohelet, however, describes the complete destruction of an elaborate and durable lamp. Even the lampstand made of silver will be smashed, and the receptacle made of gold will be crushed. He leaves no doubt about the absolute darkness that confronts all humanity. Humanity's lamp will be extinguished forever. End quote. And then he also talks about how there's broken pottery after this. And he says, like, this doesn't necessarily make sense that they're getting the water in this particular pottery or that they would be breaking it, but that it is significant that broken potsherds were often found in Jewish tombs during the Second Temple period. And those were found with the lamp. So there may be some connection between lamp and the potsherds that are found. And then the final piece, I know I'm over time here, but the final piece from this article that I wanted to share is where he says, quote, so the poet appropriately concludes, dust returns to the earth where it had been, and the life breath returns to God who gave it, verse 7. Kohelet thus reiterates his conviction that everything originates from and ends in the hand of God, end quote. And so this, like, I went from reading this as like an individual's end of life to maybe this is something that's bigger than just one particular individual, though whether or not I can take out these 8 verses and paint a picture of the eschaton remains to be seen. I'm not sure my exegetical skills are there yet, but I loved reading about this when I was looking through the literature of scholars better than I and what they had to say about it. So returning to the world in front of the text, these are the questions that I started with. So what is this the end of? Well, maybe it's a life, but maybe it is the eschaton. What is vanity? Like an emptiness, a nothingness. What is the silver cord? Maybe it plays into this idea of a lamp that's destroyed as an allegory for the end of the world. Why the admonition to remember your creator in your youth? So this is really like showing the creator is there at the beginning and there at the end. And how is the text situated in the temporal? And I think this might be the thing that I know less about than when I started, where this might be taking place in time. So this has been really fun to look into and to read about. And I hope I haven't been heretical in this adult forum. Thanks.